Our house wasn't always haunted. It was just an old, creaky place where my family had lived for years. It had its quirks, doors that didn't shut properly, floorboards that groaned with every step, and a basement that none of us liked going into. But it was home, and nothing felt out of the ordinary until the night my brother brought his friend over. That night, I remember the weather being unusually cold for that time of year. My brother, Sam, had invited his new friend, Jake, to stay over. I didn't know much about Jake, just that he was quiet and had a strange, unsettling energy about him. But Sam seemed to like him, so I didn't think much of it. They spent most of the evening in Sam's room, playing video games and listening to music. I could hear their laughter echoing through the house. It was just like any other night until the clock struck midnight. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard something from downstairs. A faint murmur, almost like chanting. I thought it was the TV at first, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My curiosity got the better of me, so I got up to investigate. The closer I got to the source, the colder the air around me became. I made my way to the living room, where the sound was coming from. As I peeked around the corner, I saw Jake kneeling in the middle of the floor, surrounded by candles. His eyes were closed, and his lips moved rapidly as he whispered something I couldn't understand. My heart started racing as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows flickered on the walls, dancing in the dim light of the flames. "Jake?" I called out. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. The chanting grew louder, more intense. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that looked almost human. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The candles were snuffed out as if by an unseen hand. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I turned it on, the room was empty. Jake was gone, and the air was thick with a heavy, oppressive feeling. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Jake left without a word. Sam acted like nothing had happened, like he didn't even remember the strange ritual from the night before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in our house. The air felt different, colder, and I started noticing things that hadn't been there before. The house creaked more often, as if something was moving around when no one was there. Doors that had always stayed shut began to swing open on their own. And the shadows on the walls seemed darker, more defined, almost as if they were watching us. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, and maybe I was just imagining things. But then the dreams started. Every night, I dreamt of that room, of Jake's ritual, of the shadows closing in on me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, feeling like I wasn't alone. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was the same chanting I had heard that night. I bolted upright in bed, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a shadowy figure. Its form was indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and menacing. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It just stood there, watching me until I finally mustered the strength to turn on the light. When the room was illuminated, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I told Sam about what I'd seen, but he just laughed it off, saying I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I started researching, trying to find any explanation for what was happening. That's when I stumbled upon something that sent chills down my spine. Jake had a history. He was involved in some kind of cult, a group that believed in summoning dark entities for power. It all started to make sense, his strange behavior, the ritual, the haunting. He had done something that night, something that opened a door to whatever was now in our house. As the weeks went by, the activity in the house escalated. Things would move on their own, objects would disappear, only to reappear in the most unsettling places. The whispering grew louder, more frequent, and the shadowy figures became bolder. I wasn't the only one experiencing it anymore. Sam started to notice it too. He became withdrawn, scared, but he still refused to talk about it. One night, after another particularly terrifying encounter, I confronted him. "We need to do something, Sam. This isn't normal, and you know it." He looked at me, fear in his eyes, and finally admitted, "I think Jake brought something into our house. I don't know what it is, but it's getting stronger. We tried everything, praying, burning sage, even bringing in a priest. But nothing worked. Whatever Jake had summoned, it was here to stay." The house, our home, had become a place of fear and dread. The once comforting creaks of the old wood now felt like the footsteps of something malevolent. We live in a constant state of fear, waiting for the next unexplained event, the next glimpse of the shadows that now rule our lives. We're prisoners in our own home, haunted by the actions of one night, by the ritual that opened a door we can't close. And the worst part? I have a feeling that it's just getting started. My Uncle George's house in the village was a place I used to love visiting as a kid. It was an old, weathered building, standing on the outskirts of a small, quiet village. The house had character, its wooden floors creaked with every step, and the windows rattled on windy nights. It had been in our family for generations, passed down from one relative to the next. But over the years, the place took on a different atmosphere, one that made everyone uneasy. Uncle George was a tough man, the kind who didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. He lived alone after my aunt passed away, and he never complained about the solitude. But there was something about the house that started to change him, slowly, subtly. It was in the way he talked, the way his eyes seemed to have lost their warmth, and the way he would glance over his shoulder as if he wasn't quite alone. It wasn't until my last visit that I began to understand why. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the yard. Uncle George greeted me with a tired smile, his once robust frame now hunched with age. He seemed glad to have company, but there was an underlying tension in his movements, a nervous energy I hadn't seen before. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I noticed how quiet the house was. The usual sounds of the village, dogs barking in the distance, the hum of crickets, were absent. It was an eerie, unnatural silence, as if the world outside had gone mute. I tried to make conversation, but Uncle George was distant, his mind elsewhere. He kept glancing at the window, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to see something in the darkness beyond. When I asked him what was wrong, he hesitated before finally speaking. "There's something about this house, something that's been bothering me for a while now," he said. "At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it's real. There's something here, something that doesn't belong." I didn't know how to respond. Uncle George had never been one to believe in anything beyond the tangible, yet here he was, admitting that something about the house was off. He told me about the strange occurrences that had started a few months back, doors that would open and close on their own, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one else was there, and the feeling of being watched, especially at night. I've tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it's just the wind or the old wood settling, but it's more than that. It's like the house is alive, like it's waiting for something. I listened, my skin crawling with unease. Uncle George wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but whatever was happening in that house had him genuinely rattled. That night, I went to bed with a sense of dread gnawing at my insides. The room I was staying in had been my mother's when she was a child. It was small, with a single bed pushed up against the wall and a window that looked out over the empty fields. The bed was uncomfortable, the mattress old and lumpy, but it wasn't that kept me awake. It was the oppressive silence, the kind that made every small sound seem amplified. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint creak, like someone was walking slowly down the hallway. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, waiting for the noise to pass, but it didn't. It stopped right outside my door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just lay there, staring at the door, half expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. Instead, there was a soft, almost inaudible tapping on the door. It was so quiet that I thought I might be imagining it, but then it came again. I wanted to scream, to shout for Uncle George, but my voice was caught in my throat. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke the next morning, the sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. But the events of the previous night were all too real. I didn't mention the footsteps to Uncle George. I wasn't sure if he would believe me, or if he'd just shrug it off as the house playing tricks on me. But I could see in his eyes that he knew something was wrong, that he felt it too. Over the next few days, I noticed more oddities, cold spots in the hallway, objects that seemed to move on their own, and that ever-present feeling of being watched. Uncle George became increasingly withdrawn, spending most of his time in his study with the door closed. When I asked him about it, he just shook his head and muttered something about unfinished business. On my last night there, I decided to take a walk around the property, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields. As I walked past the side of the house, something caught my eye, a faint glow coming from the basement window. I knew Uncle George never went down there, said it was too damp and musty for him to bother with. But the light was unmistakable. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way to the basement door. The old wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the only sound was the distant drip of water. As I reached the bottom, I saw it, a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the room. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and cobwebs that stretched from wall to wall. But what drew my attention was the far corner of the room, where the light seemed to be brightest. As I approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a series of old, yellowed photographs scattered across the floor. They were of the house, taken at various times throughout its history. But in each one, there was something strange, something I hadn't noticed before, a shadowy figure standing just out of focus, always in the same spot, always watching. I backed away, my mind racing. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear, something was very wrong with this house. I left the next morning, making some excuse about needing to get back to the city. Uncle George didn't argue, he just nodded, a distant look in his eyes. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and imposing, as if it knew something I didn't. A few weeks later, I got a call from one of the villagers. Uncle George had passed away in his sleep, they said. Peaceful, natural causes. But when I returned for the funeral, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had taken him, something that had been lurking in that house for years. We sold the house soon after, but I can't help but wonder if it's still there, whatever it was. Waiting, watching, just like it always had been.